Hey, how you doing? This is Adam Post. Even before Donald Trump won the election, DEI-based, discriminatory-based nonprofits were pretty worried because they had started to lose lawsuits when they got challenged for their discriminatory behavior. They're doing things like only making grants to people of certain skin colors, excluding other skin colors. It's hard to believe, but they have been doing it. Now they're starting to realize we might be in trouble here because, of course, this is illegal. Of course, this could only exist because of the current Department of Justice under the current administration, and it's changing immediately. Nonprofits doing this were already losing civil lawsuits. Now, with the new Department of Justice, with the new head of the Civil Rights Division, Harmeet Dillon, these guys are not going to get away with this. Coming from the Chronicle of Philanthropy, corporations and higher ed are backtracking on DEI. Will foundations fold? Yes, of course they're going to fold because they're going to have the Department of Justice saying, hey, you can't just straight out do illegal things. And you also can't just straight out do illegal things in discriminatory ways, but also build a separate business on top of this, which is what another company was doing called the Fearless Fund. I've covered that on this channel. We'll do a quick review on these guys later. As companies and universities retreat from DEI policies, grant makers that focus on racial equity are bracing for litigation. Why any of these nonprofits thought that they had a right to establish like a second tier in society where only this skin color is allowed to get certain opportunities and all the other skin colors aren't allowed to get those opportunities is really almost beyond belief. A 2023 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that affirmative action in college admissions is unconstitutional put the nonprofit world on notice. While limited to college admissions based on race, the decisions in a pair of cases brought by Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina opened the floodgates to lawsuits that test whether the use of race in other determinations, such as who gets a philanthropic grant, is discriminatory, as well as who gets a job, who gets a promotion, who gets any other opportunities. The current administration has given $1 billion towards funding DEI grants, that's cash payments, in Biden's Department of Education since 2021. That kind of thing's not going to continue. But in a culture where this was considered acceptable, at least by the federal government, you can see where this came from. The most publicized of those cases was American Alliance for Equal Rights versus Fearless Fund. The defendant was a venture firm with an associated foundation that made small grants to Black women entrepreneurs. They would give approximately $20,000 grants to female Black entrepreneurs. If you're not female, no good. If you're not Black, no good. If you've got a business, you might be good. You might be good to go if you're a female Black entrepreneur. They'd give them 20 grand, not of their own money, of money that they raised from other corporate sponsors like big banks, like big companies. And why would they do something like this? Well, of course, they're trying to give opportunity to women of color, and all that's fine, except number one, it's illegal. You can't do things like that. Number two, they were running the foundation, but also running their venture capital business. So they were using this as a way to find companies that they could later invest in. So that they're using like lead generation based on these racist grants to find businesses that they could later do a deal with through their separate investment company. They were benefiting financially off of the relationship with their nonprofit racist foundation. That alone is something you can get in serious trouble for. You can't just rifle through a foundation, a nonprofit, and make your own money off of those relationships. Things have to be done very carefully. But it was clear they were doing that. They were also using that publicity to generate financing for their venture capital business. They had better hope that the new administration is too busy doing other things than to look into what they're doing, because at least in my opinion, there are a lot of legal problems with what they did. Ultimately, their case was settled in September, with Fearless Fund ending its race-based grant program, but the settlement left the legal outlook on the topic murky. Now, as foundations and nonprofits that focus on racial equity brace for more litigation, the broader concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion has come under attack throughout all sectors. It's not under attack. It's just, look, you can't do this illegal stuff anymore if you don't control essentially the Justice Department, which is setting the tone for criminal lawsuits for things like this, as well as civil lawsuits. But the civil lawsuits, even during the current administration, were going through and they were getting good positive results to stop this kind of illegal behavior. In late November, Walmart said it would not renew a 5-year, $100 million commitment to its Center for Racial Equity, which researched the root causes of racial disparities in education, health, and criminal justice, and brought nonprofits together to encourage equity approaches. That $100 million funding was enough to give money to so-called scholars to pursue these silly racist ideas. Deere & Company, Lowe's, and JP Morgan have also backed away from policies meant to address racial disparities. It's really like a failed coup. Normalcy is coming back to the country. Their coup didn't work. Meanwhile, public universities, including those in Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, Wisconsin, have backpedaled on DEI, no longer requiring applicants for faculty positions to write statements that explain how they would advance diversity and equity in their teaching and research. Foundations and nonprofits are watching these developments closely, along with the return to the White House of Donald Trump, an avowed critic of efforts to support diversity, equity, and inclusion. At least their version of it. Trump wants what we all want, which is merit-based institutions in our country. Private, government, public, all of them. Treat everyone the same, whether it comes to opportunity or it comes to help. Trump has pledged to scrap DEI requirements in the federal government on the first day he's in office. And it is a mess in the federal government. It's going to take more than a day, but he can start working on it on day one. Nonprofits will be under enormous pressure to change policies that specify race, according to legal experts. Some have already retreated. For instance, in February, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Latino was sued by the American Alliance for Equal Rights, led by Edward Blum, the legal strategist behind the Supreme Court Affirmative Action and Fearless Fund cases. Edward Blum worked on this case in the Supreme Court to deal with college admissions and make them fair again based on merit for decades. He put a lot of time and a lot of resources into this. He really put a lot of his life into getting normalcy back into our society through the Supreme Court. And thank goodness he was able to do it. Blum's nonprofit argued that limiting 12-week internship programs to Latino students was unconstitutional. And after reaching a settlement in March, the museum announced that students of all races were qualified. If you ever get a phone call from Edward Blum or this guy, Stephen Miller, and they say, hey, you know what? We have a problem with a few of the things that you're doing at your company or your organization. It's a good idea to listen to them and try to sort things out before you get into lawsuits with them, because these guys tend to win a lot. Other DEI skeptics who have litigated against diversity efforts are set to be at the center of Trump's administration's decision-making apparatus. Chief among them is Stephen Miller. That's this guy, whose legal advocacy nonprofit, America First Legal, filed a dozen cases against educational and corporate diversity programs over the past 2 years. Miller will be Trump's deputy chief of staff for policy. One of Miller's cases is a major case against the Hollywood studio, Paramount. Miller's lawsuit is on behalf of a writer who was not given an opportunity to be a staff writer because of his sexual preference and his skin color, at least according to his lawsuit and according to evidence that they filed in the lawsuit. That's an important lawsuit against that Hollywood studio because it sets a tone in Hollywood that, no, you can't just hire people because you say you're producing creative things in a discriminatory way. You can't literally say, which is what they said in their defense, that we want to hire people of certain genders and certain skin colors and backgrounds because that's the kind of writing that we like, regardless of what their ability actually is. That's a landmark case, similar to the Gina Carano case. Miller is not even an attorney. He just started this legal advocacy group, which has been very successful. Nearly 100 other DEI-related lawsuits have been filed in the past 3 years by conservative legal nonprofits, according to a tally compiled by the New York University School of Law's Meltzer Center. Quote, this is going to be a big shift, says Isabel Layton, executive director of the Donors of Color Network, a group of about 200 philanthropists who seek to advance racial justice. Quote, a lot of the private actors now have the keys to policymaking, and they're going to feel very emboldened to enshrine a lot of what they were doing into law. Yeah, because it is the law, and there are already laws to protect this. And we'll get into the specifics. Layton predicted that the notion of philanthropic freedom, the idea long cherished by conservatives, that donors should be able to give to whatever causes they choose will be severely tested by lawsuits aiming to curtail grants made to people of a specific race. So far, they're not going after the donors. They're going after the illegal organizations that are giving out the donations on a discriminatory and/or crooked basis. Foundations focused on racial equity, she said, face a decision about whether to accommodate the new legal and political environment by taking mention of race off the table, or to hold fast to their mission to increase the visibility of and find a solution to disparities based on race. And of course, nonprofits are not going to find solutions to any disparities that they see in the culture based on race. There are no solutions except to invest in whatever culture you're living in, which is the American culture, and ascribe yourself to the principles that, like merit, is going to improve your life. In some ways, the battle over race-based nonprofit programs is a fight between protecting philanthropic freedom and the idea that private grant-making is a form of constitutionally protected free expression, and a civil rights statute dating from the 1860s that forbids discrimination based on race in private contracts. The Reconstruction-era law, meant to protect formerly enslaved persons, is now being used by litigants like Blum, Miller, and others to try to dismantle race-based grant-making, because there are laws against what they are actually and literally doing. And that's one of them. The civil rights law, the litigants argue, is colorblind and should be interpreted to curtail discrimination against anyone by virtue of their background. The purpose of this law was to give people equal opportunity that did not have equal opportunity based on normal constitutional rights, not an extra constitutional right, not a new right, a new protection based on skin color. It identified a group of people that weren't getting opportunities or that they didn't want to have excluded from opportunities in contracts and said, hey, you can't do that to those people. Why did they not specifically mention all races at that time? Because it wasn't a problem with all races at that time. But of course, the purpose of the law was to treat human beings equally, because we are all equal. We ought to have all the same opportunities, though we can't all have the same outcomes and the same success. We're not all born that way. We're not all raised that way. It's a question of values. It's a question of family. It's not a question of skin color. And there are no laws that are going to apply to only one skin color in the United States, but not other skin colors. That is their defense for what they're doing. There is no defense for that. An emphasis on DEI is by its nature discriminatory because it pushes favoritism based on race, argues Jonathan Butcher, a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. Following the corporate reversals, nonprofits that promote diversity are next in line to receive public condemnation from the right. But when they're called out on their DEI programs and statements, they back away from them, according to Butcher, saying of companies criticized for their DEI work. The same thing should be happening at the charitable sector. And this argument they're making, where they're saying, look, what about the freedom to give philanthropically, like wherever you want to give? Like, yeah, you as an individual can select someone for your own public or private reasons and directly give that person money. You don't have to go and give money to people that you don't know or people that you don't want to give resources or money to. They're not talking about suing individual donors. They're saying you can't create a racist organization and perpetuate that racist organization based on saying that you have some freedom to do that because you kind of feel like it. It's really the same kind of defense that Hollywood has, saying, look, it's a constitutional right for us to have free expression. And if we want to have expression expressed only by certain people with skin colors that match this, or skin colors or races that match that, or sexual preferences that are this way, we're allowed to hire those people and discriminate against everyone else, even though they might be qualified, because as we think, it's not a qualification unless you have this specific personal characteristic. Also illegal, also not going to fly. And that's why they're getting sued. On the first day of his presidency in January 2021, Joe Biden issued an executive order titled Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities Through the Federal Government, which aimed to ensure people of color and lower-income Americans could achieve their full potential with regard to federal benefits and grants. Since then, the push for equity has seeped into every nook and cranny of federal operations, according to Ian Kingsbury, director of research at the conservative nonprofit Do No Harm, which tallied more than 500 examples of DEI policies throughout federal agencies. And when they say they're addressing lower income Americans, if it's not discriminatory based on race, based on gender, that's okay. If it is discriminatory, then it's not okay. And all of this federally funded DEI stuff is discriminatory, and it's going to stop. Nonprofits focused on equity and anticipated a windfall in federal support because of Biden's executive orders and legislative language in major spending bills that required an equity component. Federal support for transport and climate change projects distributed through local governments and networks of nonprofits especially targeted communities of color over the last 4 years. For instance, under the Just 40 Biden program, 40% of all clean energy, climate, and sustainable housing investments have been earmarked for groups marginalized by underinvestment. One Chicago nonprofit, Blacks in Green, plans to use a $10 million U.S. Environmental Protection Agency grant to build a solar and geothermal grid on the city's south side. But DEI's moment has come and gone, according to Kingsbury. Well, politically, it's a real liability because it peddles in grievance and political extremism, he says. The Justice Department is probably going to take on an active role in enforcement. Oh, the Justice Department is going to be extremely active. Meanwhile, progressive grant makers believe the Justice Department and other federal agencies will go after nonprofits by sending cease and desist letters to nonprofits engaging in race-based programming, or by revoking tax-exempt status from nonprofits engaging in activities deemed to counter the Trump administration's policy agenda. For the Justice Department to send a cease and desist letter to, let's say, 1,000 of these organizations is very inexpensive, very quick, very easy. They can have them out probably in a week. They will give these organizations most likely an opportunity to stop doing what they're doing that's illegal, and then let the Justice Department know that, yeah, we've stopped, we apologize, we're not going to continue with this behavior, and here's how we're going to do our things going forward. Here's how we're going to not be illegal or race-based and do normal business. Anyone who makes themselves a troublemaker will get in trouble. And the guys that don't comply with what they said they were going to do in their response to the cease and desist letter are also going to get in trouble because they're going to look over these people. They know if people were willing to break the law on a Monday, even though they say they weren't going to do it again, they're very likely to break the law again the following Monday or a couple of Mondays later. They're going to catch these guys. It's very unlikely they would go and revoke tax-exempt status like without having conversations with these guys. But one of the things they will threaten to do is revoke their tax-exempt status, which means goodbye nonprofit. They can't operate without that. By casting DEI and race-based grant-making efforts as un-American or unfair, rather than attempts to right historical wrongs, the Trump administration is poised to transform public programs and change the way people understand the history of racism in America, says Fred Blackwell, CEO of the San Francisco Foundation. Quote, they're pursuing a dampening effect, Blackwell says. In the face of that pressure, it's understandable that some foundations might want to avoid mention of race in their work. They might just want to do that. But foundations involved in racial justice work have a responsibility to try to influence public discourse, he says, and it's necessary to bring race to the forefront when trying to improve poor social outcomes. Actually, it's not necessary. It is illegal if they're going to continue to do this, and they're going to find that people like Stephen Miller and Harmeet Dillon and other people in the new Justice Department have zero patience for their nonsense. Because people who want to create a racist environment in any part of society are really poisoning society. That can't continue. Regardless of what they say that their intention is, it's wrong, and it damages the country. It damages the American experience. We don't do that here. But to get their message across, philanthropy leaders are attempting to more forcefully communicate the benefits that they see from an equity focus, which is actually funny in a lot of articles. You see them trying to justify, hey, sure, there's a financial return on investment to DEI programs, and hey, this really is helping society. It's always silly. It never makes sense, and occasionally I cover it because it's really ridiculous. The Bridgespan Group, for instance, released a multimedia collection in December celebrating DEI, and the Krieg Foundation announced a 3-year fellowship program to support a pipeline of leaders committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice. The goal is to train a cadre of social change professionals that's well prepared for fights against DEI. Supporters of DEI programs are scrambling to defend anticipated lawsuits. Foundations should make sure their work is legally defensible, quote, recognizing that an attack could come, according to Bonamy Johnson, Senior Director of Special Initiatives at ABFE, formerly known as the Association of Black Foundation Executives. What kind of people are these that now, because they think they may get in trouble, they're actually going and checking the legality of what it is that they're doing? For anyone who's been involved in a nonprofit or been involved in a business and taken investor money, for example, you know that we have to go through these things. Like before we start taking actions, we have to understand that we're in a legal situation. We're in a legal business. You can't do things that are questionably legal and then say, oh, you know something? We might get in trouble here. Let's kind of check and make sure, like, how can we continue to get away with it? It doesn't really sound legitimate because it's not legitimate. ABFE and the California Black Freedom Fund each have pooled funds to train lawyers on civil rights law and provide pro bono legal assistance to nonprofits fearful of DEI-related lawsuits. Another effort, MN Legal, Education, Advocacy, and Defense, was modeled after the California Fund and created by the Minnesota Black Collective Foundation, a Black community foundation. Louette Mola, who leads the Minnesota effort, fears that concerns over the incoming administration's approach will lead to a watered-down approach to racial justice. She points to one of the recommendations of Project 2025 that calls for doing away with the collection of data on race and ethnicity, including employment figures collected by the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, and effort to be colorblind in its approach to social programs. Mola fears foundations that make grants to Black-led organizations or to improve educational or other outcomes for Black people are scrubbing race from their grant guidelines, requests for proposals, and grant agreements to try to avoid public scrutiny and lawsuits. Quote, there will be an erasure of race-conscious efforts, she warns, if references to race are replaced by proxies such as the zip code of a grant recipient. Without that race-specific language, policymakers and philanthropy leaders will not be able to collect data on whether government or grant-making interventions are actually having the desired effect, she says. Rather than arguing that grants are constitutionally protected gifts, another approach is to argue that race-based grant-making conforms to civil rights law, which allows using race as a criteria to remedy past racial disparities in areas like public health and education. Specifying the race of an intended grant recipient can help ensure foundation money has the greatest impact, argues Eric Ward, Executive Vice President at Race Forward, a racial equity advocacy nonprofit. Ward suggests that nonprofit leaders prepare to defend their race-related work by ensuring the language of their grant agreements, quote, acknowledges the legal and political landscape that has put race-based grant-making under the microscope. He suggests grant makers thoroughly document how their grants conform to their organization's tax-exempt mission and aim to address disparities based on race. Because if you run a nonprofit and you accept donations and then you give grants out that don't really exactly match what you said your nonprofit was supposed to do, that's why you got that nonprofit status from the IRS, you got a problem there because you just kind of broke the law and stuff. These people have made themselves targets by doing things they know they're not supposed to be doing. Quote, clarity and intention is likely the strongest shield against legal challenges, according to Ward, especially when it comes to upholding goals that serve the public, which this does not do. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments below. Always love to see your ideas. Please be sure you are subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you again soon with another story. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.